Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. Coming up, Iran shook by violent mass protests after a young woman dies in police custody, having been detained for not properly wearing a headscarf. I'll be talking shortly to Suzanne Tamasebi, a women's rights activist and an Iranian specialist. Also, the Ukrainian military has been swelled by thousands of female soldiers, but who are struggling with material designed for men. We meet those raising money to ensure women soldiers get the equipment they need. And a group of Indigenous women in Bolivia scale mountains wearing traditional skirts as they seek to educate others about the discrimination and violence they face. But first, Iran has been rocked in recent days by mass protests sparked by the death in custody of a 22-year-old woman detained for not wearing a headscarf properly. Mahsa Amini was visiting Tehran from the country's Kurdistan province when she was detained by the infamous morality police for not having the appropriate attire. She died later at a detention centre, with police claiming she had suffered a heart attack. Now, Iranian laws require women to cover their hair and wear loose-fitting robes. But in recent years, an increasing number of women have protested, with some having appeared in public without the required scarf and robe, a move which is highly risky. Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Suzanne Tamasebi, a leading women's rights advocate and an Iranian specialist. Suzanne, thank you for your time. Firstly, just how dangerous is it for a woman in Iran to be out in public without wearing a headscarf or not wearing it properly?
Well, I should say that women have resisted the mandatory hijab since its establishment of laws that require it from 40 years ago. So they've consistently and always pushed the boundaries of the mandatory hijab and have never dressed according to what the Iranian officials who advocate this hijab, or the image of the perfect, Iranian Muslim woman. They've never conformed to that image. And in recent years, certainly, I think we've seen a lot more women going out in public without the hijab. It's a pretty regular occurrence, but of course it can have serious consequences because they can get arrested by the morality police, and the morality police usually use a lot of violence to arrest women. And if nothing else, it's a very humiliating experience to be told what to wear and to be arrested if you don't adhere to those requirements. So, and if you have violence like you did in the case of Mahsa or in other cases, it can be very dangerous. It's never a good thing to be arrested and detained, and it's frightening and can be dangerous. But in the case of Mahsa, unfortunately, it was very extreme and it resulted in her death.
Suzanne, there have been protests before, notably in 2009, when the death of another young woman sparked days of widespread unrest, not seen since the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Now, we're seeing women burning their headscarves or cutting their hair in protest. But how are these protests in 2022 different?
These protests are a little bit different in the sense that this is the first time ever that people are coming out to protest and to make a demand that's in support of women's rights. The demands of the protesters are accountability and justice for Mahsa, and with respect to her wrongful death, her killing in custody, and the elimination of mandatory hijab laws and the elimination of violent enforcement policies, the morality police. And so this is the first time that we see people coming out protesting across the country in multiple cities, taking huge risks to make a demand that has to do with women and women's rights. And we've never seen this before, so it's unprecedented in this sense.
And Suzanne, following those 2009 protests and the election of hardliner Ebrahim Raisi a year and a half ago, the country has cracked down heavily on any forms of dissent. This is certainly not a government who welcomes any form of vocal opposition, does it?
No, of course not. We've had several protests in the last 5 years that have all met with violence. They started during Rouhani's time, and that violence was rather shocking because people didn't expect that would be that level of violence and killing in 2017, 2019, and now this protest. Of course, we have protests all the time. Teachers protest, workers protest, other forms of protest, women's protests. They went out a number of years ago But they haven't gotten as big. But these three incidences, the protests have gotten nationwide, and they've been met with incredible violence. And the violence, we expect the violence now with Raisi in power and with all the turmoil that's going on in the country to be much worse. And now, as you probably know, the internet is being shut down, which creates a lot of fear for us, because we know when the internet is shut down, then there's, it gives officials a free hand to commit violence without anybody being able to record it and to hold them accountable internationally. So it's a great point of concern.
Is this a seminal moment for Iran?
It is an important moment in the sense that Iranians are going out to protest a demand for women. It's an important moment for Iranian women to have a chance to really express very publicly their level of outrage and anger. But in terms of really creating real change, I'm not sure if that's going to happen. And at minimum, I hope that they manage to result in the demands of the protesters, which again is the accountability for the death of Mahsa and the ending of all mandatory hijab laws and violent enforcement. So if that happens, that will be a real turning point, because it will be the first time that the Iranian establishment, the Iranian state, has actually responded to a demand by the public. It's unfortunate that they never sort of heed the calls of its citizens, no matter how it's expressed, whether it's through petitions or through meetings with parliament or whatever. They've never, especially with women, very rarely have they backed down on any sort of law. And so, and definitely when there's protests, they refuse to do it because they see it as a sign of weakness, whereas actually it would be a sign of a government listening to its own people. So if they respond to the demands, it'll be a turning point in that sense, and it would be an important achievement, but I doubt it.
Suzanne Tamasebi, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you for paying attention to this important issue.
To Ukraine now, and thousands of women are currently serving in the Ukrainian army as they fight against Russian forces, but their equipment is often not designed with women in mind. So one charity is raising funds to ensure female soldiers get the material they need. Our team in Kiev sent us this report.
Before the start of the war, Shura worked in the fashion business. Now she's using her old skills to raise money for women in the army. But her uniform isn't just for show. It's what she wears every day at the front, where she faces the same conditions as the men.
Мы должны уметь делать все. Ездить на зиле и в окопы копать.
You have to be able to do everything. Drive military trucks and dig trenches. It's the army. No exceptions are made for us. You have to be ready for anything.
Которая бы защитила нас от чего-либо. Нет, мы должны быть готовы ко всему.
But the Ukrainian army wasn't ready for such a large intake of women. It lacks equipment designed for female soldiers. Shura hopes this photo shoot with Zemlyachki will help change that. Part of the proceeds from the sales of the jewelry will go to buy equipment.
We found sponsors who are helping us with humanitarian aid. Some are buying uniforms, others bulletproof plates for flak jackets. They cost a lot of money, and the helmets need to be lighter and smaller. They're not easy to find.
In addition to hygiene products and women's underwear, Zemlyachki has already supplied 300 flak jackets for women at the front.
These plates weigh less than 3 kilos, but they give similar protection to those provided by the army, which weigh 5 kilos. So the protection is just as good, and they're twice as light.
But Zemlyachki knows it has to step up its efforts. With the approach of winter, Ksenia estimates 50,000 women are going to need specially designed cold weather uniforms.
And finally, a group of Indigenous women in Bolivia are using unusual tactics to combat sexism. They scale treacherous mountains while wearing their traditional skirts. This to raise awareness about the discrimination and violence that they regularly face. Catherine Kedder-Clifford reports.
Armed with helmets, ice axes and ropes, these Bolivian women set out from their hometown close to La Paz. Though the journey ahead is a long one, their destination is soon within sight. The indigenous women, nicknamed Cholitas, aim to reach the tip of Huayna Potosí mountain at an altitude of more than 6,000 meters.
I love climbing mountains. I like the way our skirts flutter at the top of the mountain. It's like being above the clouds.
The Cholitas are determined to climb to the top wearing their traditional Aymara dress, a political choice and a stance against sexism. A cause that gives them the strength to keep climbing through the night until they reach the summit. It's the second time they've climbed this mountain.
In
2015, we got together to climb this mountain, where we are now, to show that women are strong and brave, that we can do it with our clothes, our skirts.
After this first expedition, they climbed a dozen mountains across Bolivia, Peru and Argentina. At the top, they play football, another anti-sexism demonstration.
There has been a lot of discrimination against women in pollera skirts and a lot of femicides.
According to international organizations, Bolivia has the highest rate of femicide in South America. The Cholitas are determined to keep aiming higher in their fight, setting their sights on Mount Everest.
And that's all for now. You can keep up with the 51% on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. Plus you can catch our previous programs on the France 24 website. So until our next show, bye for now.